Well, it's good to have everybody join us. Welcome to Conversations with Mary Ann, and we are reaching you live from Lagos, Nigeria. It is the economic capital of the country, and of course, as usual, we talk about the big stories coming out from Africa. And today we're going to Burkina Faso. Yes, there have been stories about crises and issues in the Sahel region, and so we decided today that we'll start with Burkina Faso. Now, Burkina Faso is currently experiencing one of the most rapidly deteriorating humanitarian crises in the world, exacerbated by COVID-19, and we all know that. From every part of the world, we're all experiencing the sting of this pandemic, a pandemic that nobody has ever seen, a strain that is developing and multiplying itself, and it seems like it's not going anywhere anytime soon. But thank goodness there has been some vaccines out there, although there's also some gleam understanding that like Africa in general might not be having access to these vaccines anytime soon. But that's not what we're talking about today. In April 2020, the number of internally displaced persons in Burkina Faso was almost 848,000. That's 84% of whom are women and children. And we also know that in every conflict, in every war, in different parts of the world, women and children are always mostly the victims. I mean, we talked about the Congo the other day, and children were the focal point where they were forced into slavery and illegal mining. And so this is where we're going to focus our attention on today's conversation. And as it is, there are 2.2 million people who are in need of humanitarian assistance in Burkina Faso. Now, I do not live in Burkina Faso, but my guest today is a journalist, a broadcast journalist who covers stories from across West Africa. He is a journalist with the West African Democratic Radio, and it is in Dakar, Senegal. Imoide, thank you very much for joining us. I almost said democracy because, it's a thing here in Nigeria, but thank you for joining us. Oh, my goodness, I couldn't hear you, but I'm sure you said something. Can you say that again? Oh dear. Well, Imor, I'm going to start, but I gave some statistics about what Burkina Faso is experiencing right now. Let's start with the fact that the major problem that Burkina Faso is experiencing is an ethnic and religious crisis, which has become a full, crisis, more like something that we have here in the northeast of Nigeria, where we're fighting Boko Haram. Walk us through what's happening there, and how did it start, if you have any idea?
Thank you very much for having me on your show, Marianne. And first of all, Burkina Faso is a landlocked country. They were never known to have insurgency or issues relating to insecurity, not until 2019, when we saw the ISWAP coming in from the southern part of Niger Republic. Remember, I mentioned that Burkina Faso is a landlocked country surrounded by countries, and so the crisis in Mali actually is trickling down to the northern part of Burkina Faso. And so this started around 2019, and it started like the regular raiding, like what we see in Nigeria. Bandits will come in, raid a village and then move away with goods and stuff like that. So it started like that until major insurgencies started happening, and then ISWAP, Al Qaeda, all laying claims to that. So that has really troubled the landlocked country. But again, we have seen President Christian Macabori making frantic effort to fight back the insurgency. As a matter of fact, as bad as the insurgency was, it stopped a large of the population from participating in last month's election, November's election, But again, he was able to gain more than 60% of the vote because of the trust the people had in him, and the fact that he also rode on the campaign of ensuring to push back the insurgency in the northern part of the country. So before now, I mean, when you mention countries with such issues, Burkina Faso was out of it. Lately we've seen, Al-Qaeda link ISWAP or a faction of Boko Haram, all trying to have a place in, the Sahel region, from Nigeria down to Burkina Faso to Mali, and then to part of Mauritania, and Guinea. They're all there. So it's a fight to gain dominance in these areas, and that is why we've seen the northern part, not all part of Burkina Faso, but just, of course, just like what we're going through in the northern part of Nigeria. So the northern part of Burkina Faso is actually where all of this insurgencies is taking place. So it's quite unfortunate that this is happening now. And we're hoping that with the incumbent winning on the platform, on the campaign of pushing back insurgency, we may see Burkina Faso going back to how we used to know Burkina Faso, a peaceful, country in the Sahel region.
Let me take you up on other issues. President Kabore, just as you mentioned, had promised in 2020 that he'd bring together the nation. He was going to bring the warring factions to a level playing field of sorts, so there could be a reconciliation because of the ethnic and religious tensions that were going on. And he said he was going to do this in his second tenure, which is actually now. So I'm wondering, has he done anything in that regard? And has it yielded? I mean, you have also mentioned that he's trying really hard, but has it yielded any form of positivity? Is there a reduction, or is it getting worse?
Don't also forget that Boko Haram, the
Oh, I think we lost him more there for a second. But once he's back, we will continue with the conversation. But for those who are just joining us, we're talking about Burkina Faso and the issue of armed violence taking place in the country. And this has resulted in one of the fastest growing humanitarian problems across the world. There's so many people who have projected that this might get out of hand if care is not taken. But I'd just like to quickly play us a video from the UNHCR, giving us a picture, painting a picture of what exactly Burkina Faso is experiencing right now, and that way it can, give you a basis for our conversation. Hopefully, once that video ends, we will have our guest back on to talk with us. He's joining us from Dakar, Senegal, a broadcast journalist with West Africa Democratic Radio in Dakar, Senegal. So take a look at that video, and when we come back, we'll talk.
Tum diyo ya ba biye min taman ne Allah ban kan ya tun ko baal ma diru wo de kar kiye kar ban tin ne ti ha ban ti mo ba ko bi diye bi to la biya yel kam man ke se
On ne parle plus de l'éducation, on ne parle plus des droits humanitaires, on ne parle que de la vie maintenant. On ne se soucie pas de l'alimentation ni d'autres choses. On se soucie de notre vie maintenant.
Well, that video is courtesy of UNHCR telling us or giving us a brief idea or background into what's happening in Burkina Faso. My guest, Imor, is back. Apparently, he dropped off the internet, but he's back here. Now, Imor, that video, courtesy of the UNHCR, paints a picture of the humanitarian crisis that Burkina Faso is experiencing. And this is detailed for, other countries in the Sahel, but Burkina Faso's own somewhat has become the worst ever. But let's talk about what the United Nations has had to say about this. They did say that Burkina Faso could soon become another Syria because of what's going on there, and if care is not taken in dealing with this conflict, because it is one of the fastest growing displacement crises across the world. Now, for someone who's covering developments from those parts of the continent, do you agree with this statement by the United Nations? And why would you think it would be compared to Syria?
It's a worrisome report from the UN there, and it's frightening to see the figures spike. Women and children getting affected by this crisis. And like you mentioned earlier, I also know that Kabore has been trying to make peace with the warring faction or the opposition led by Komboigo. And we're hoping that as this second tenure of his, takes off, we may see him trying to resolve. Because if he can't resolve what he has with the opposition or people in the northern region of the country, the crisis will continue and may even escalate. Or may even be worse than the crisis in Syria. So it's
well, we lost our guest once again. The internet is not necessarily friendly today, but we are, if you're just joining us, we're talking about Burkina Faso, the issue of insecurity, violence, the displacement of women and children. And of course, don't forget, not just the violence, they are facing an issue of food and water scarcity. Amidst the fight against the pandemic, such as COVID-19, they are fighting on all fronts. And as I just noted, the United Nations has warned that Burkina Faso, if care is not taken, might just turn out to become another Syria. Now, if you're watching us, Facebook, Twitter, join the conversation. If you have questions, you have comments, my guest, Imor Edet, is a broadcast journalist with West Africa Democratic Radio, and he broadcasts from Senegal, Dakar, Senegal, and he covers stories from across West Africa. He's been looking closely at what's happening in the Sahel region. And so we decided today that we're going to talk about Burkina Faso and all that's going on in the country. And so we're wondering, how can Burkina Faso's situation be dealt with? Because it looks like the whole of the Sahel region is experiencing almost the same thing, ethnic and religious crisis, mostly jihadists. And this is spreading very fast. Now, the country's president had said that he's doing his best to see if he could, one way or the other, reconcile the warring factions. But is that the way to go? I would like to hear from you. We're still hoping that our guest will join us again, so we can quickly have that conversation. And of course, we want to know what you think about what's happening in Dakar, I beg your pardon, in Burkina Faso. It is a crisis situation. 84% of the people who are suffering from displacement and of course hunger are women and children. Yes, because the women and children hardly get involved in the fighting. Hopefully we can get our guest back in, but let me just go back to that video put together by the UNHCR to give you another idea of what's happening in that part of the world.
Tum dio ya ba ye min taman ne Allah ban kan ya Tunko Bad man, dear would get car here. But you name of Tingham, but you about probably dear, it's all a beer, your command.
Okay, so Imo is back. So let's apologies. I know these things happen. We're gradually trying to get to the point where we never have to have this internet disruptions and we can have free flow conversations. So we were still talking about the United Nations projection as to how far this conflict can go, and of course they're also trying to compare it to Syria, saying that it might just be another Syria situation if it's not controlled. So you were saying?
Yes, I remember saying that, yes, if this is not an even a bud, we may see it escalating even further than what we saw in Syria. But again, going just beyond what the UN is projecting, already we've seen over 1 million people displaced by the conflict in that part of the country. And there've been a lot of commitment from the UN, from the Norwegian Refugee Council, UNICEF, all of them, WHO. They're all trying to ensure that this issue is tackled. In fact, as bad as it is, almost 800,000 children are deprived of education. Women all trying to find a way to the northern part of Ghana and to neighboring countries. So it's a time bomb waiting to explode, and the time is really counting for Kabore. Now that the opposition may have relaxed a bit to allow him continue his second term, they may actually run out of patience, because I remember you asked me if we've started seeing anything. I mean, it's quite too early for us to say yes, we have seen him make effort to bring opposition together. It's quite too early. So we may just have to wait, possibly maybe after the second 2 quarters, perhaps, to see if whatever effort Kabore has in plan or had in mind to handle the violence and insecurity in that part of the country, can actually work. It's not just a day thing. It will take a very long time. Also, don't forget that around the Sahel region, we're seeing more of ISWAP and the rest of them all fighting for dominance. We've seen that happen in Niger Republic. We've seen that happen in Mali. We've seen that happen, of course, in Burkina Faso, and we have seen the French troops, have bases in this country. So it's a time bomb, like I said, and we're only waiting to see what Kabore is going to pull out of his sleeve to ensure that the warring factions, and the rest of them, can align with his vision, and then we see a peaceful Burkina Faso. But we're worried, and the projection of the UN, Norwegian Council, and the rest of them may actually go worse than what we're seeing in Syria.
Okay, I mean, when you went off, I was just telling the audience that Burkina Faso seems to be fighting on all fronts. We're talking about a food crisis, water crisis. Yeah. We're talking about a pandemic that you cannot get rid of or you cannot control if you do not have access to potable water. Also, they're having to deal with, militants, and then there's some projection of famine, in the radar. It seems to be like their plate is literally full for a country that is not necessarily like South Africa or Nigeria in terms of financing and the rest of it. So I'm wondering, how is this being managed? I'm talking about in terms of water, in terms of healthcare. You cannot have proper healthcare if you also don't have access to water. So how is all of this being managed by the governments and all of the people who work with them?
Well, they have been enjoying support from international partners, international agencies, WHO, Medecins Sans Frontières, the Red Cross, and the rest of them. So some time ago I spoke with somebody from Doctors Without Border, and yes, the situation there is not too pleasing. Let me put it that way. Like I mentioned, support have been coming in from these organizations in terms of provision of this basic amenities, makeshift schools in refugee camps, water supplied by UN agencies and some other NGOs that wouldn't want their names to be mentioned. So it's a dicey issue in that part of the country. But again, we have seen effort by Kabori to ensure that basic infrastructures. Yeah, I mean, if you list countries, with poverty index, Burkina Faso is captured among the first 20 in Africa. Coupled with this crisis, coupled with the famine and COVID-19, like you mentioned, they are having their plate full at this point. So most of the support have been coming in from the agency. Now, this is not to say that the government of Burkina Faso is not doing anything to take care of this issue. And again, there's also the support from the IMF. IMF have been supporting countries in the Sahel region. Senegal is one of it in terms of financing, funding the COVID-19 plans. And Burkina Faso is one country that has also enjoyed this funding from these big agencies. I am sure that in the coming days we may see things happening. We're ruling out the first tenure of President Kabore. We haven't really seen much. Of course, the last 2 years has been plagued, by insurgency. We're hoping that in this first year, second, and possibly before the third, there may be some key changes, not just in the people who he's working with, but the fact that the opposition aligning with his vision, aligning with him, and to ensure that the northern part of the country, which is plagued by this insecurity, is really taken care of. Right now, the challenges is making peace with the opposition, and once that is done, now they can now start looking at how can we take care of the issues in the northern part of the country. How can we push back the insurgencies that have dropped in from Mali and other part of the Sahel? So it's a big one for him. It will only take a miracle to work this out. You also know that countries plagued by insurgency, it takes a very long time before that can be taken care of. Nigeria is battling one. And we also have Mali, with the transition government in power, also battling the one in northern part, linking Mauritania. So the Sahel is so plagued that the AU forces, the ECOWAS forces may not even be able to push these guys back. Except we have the French forces, we have the MINUSMA, which is a coalition of countries in the Sahel, with the French forces, to push these guys back. So it's a big one, I must say. And it's not just to comment on it, but we may do all the talkings, but if there are no actions, we'll still be saying the same thing in years to come.
All right, let me take you up on education, which is one of the major issues that the world is facing, even amidst this pandemic, and then talk more of a crisis such as this, where you have an armed conflict. Children are being caught in the crosshairs of this whole violence, and most of all the children, all these children cannot have access to education. A few of them have been able to flee to neighboring countries, and working with some NGOs, they're able to get a glimmer of hope. But what is the fate of these surviving children, the children who are left in these camps, children who cannot access education? Are there alternatives in place for these children to be served, even though they cannot get access to classrooms right now? Imo, can you hear me? Oh dear. I think we lost him for a second there. He will come back, but of course we're still talking about the issue in Burkina Faso, and I have a very interesting question here by Dr. Snoop Falagus, and she's asking for comments on Thomas Sankara. I'm hoping that when Imo is back, we will probably talk about him briefly. Thank you everybody who's joined us so far. Thank you very much. Heavenly Dew, joining us from Dallas, Texas. Thank you to Anonymous, Dr. Anonymous from Oro Valley, and of course Norbert Gilbert. Thank you all for being part of the conversation. Imo is back. Imo, sorry we lost you for a second there.
Yeah. Sorry about that. Yeah, so I was saying, you were talking about education, and most of, like mentioned, I mean, they have been cut off from the system. A lot of them have been home for a very long time due to COVID-19 lockdown and some of the other restrictive measures, put in place by the Burkina government. But as it is, for those that are, facing in the front line, those that are affected by this crisis, nothing really much can be said. I mean, over 800,000 children out of school in that part of the country, both boys and girls. So I remember you mentioned makeshift education. Yes, they may be getting something of such courtesy of NGOs that are working around that region. But I tell you, it may get very bad if these refugees in their own, displaced people are not returned back home and reintegrated properly. As it is now, I can tell you clearly that they are at border point of these countries where UN agencies have set up refugee camps to take them in. So not much can be said about them getting education as it stands. But again, like I said, the earlier the better for the Burkina. If this crisis isn't resolved in time, we may see the figures going over 1 million to 2 as it stands. But I must say that it's not a pleasant period for those in that northern part of the country. For education, is a complete write-off. Now that countries in the Sahel are even enforcing the COVID-19 lockdown due to the resurgence of a second wave, you can imagine what will happen to this displaced children and women. So for now, nothing really much may happen in that part.
My final question before we talk about the way forward. We did mention over and over during this conversation that the Sahel region seems to be experiencing almost similar cases, and it just makes me really wonder what's responsible for this. If it is bad governance, is this the result of bad governance? Is it a product of lack of political will to deal with these issues when they started? Because of course this is more like the middle, or if not the peak of the crisis. What exactly is responsible for this, aside from the natural issues of food crisis, famine in the radar? Oh my goodness, I think we lost Imo. Hopefully he gets back in a few minutes so we can wrap up this conversation. Apologies, the internet at his end might probably not be so friendly, but anyway, you are listening to us as we talk about the insecurity, the armed violence, and the conflict in the Sahel region. And we're talking mostly about Burkina Faso, because Burkina Faso is experiencing what we would call the fastest growing humanitarian crisis, exacerbated, by the way, by COVID-19. Now, we have a president, Kabore, who has promised and vowed that he would address the situation and bring warring factions to the table to, one way or the other, quell this situation. But the question is, has that been done? My guest has been saying that, well, the government has been trying its best, but then the question is the best that the government of Burkina Faso doing good enough? Don't forget that the president of Nigeria, President Muhammadu Buhari, who sits on ECOWAS, has been visiting countries like the Gambia, which we spoke about a couple of days ago, also visited countries like Burkina Faso, and has talked with the government. But my guest did also mention that the forces that we have, whether it's AU or ECOWAS, might be outnumbered or might be overly stretched, dealing with the crisis in the Sahel region. And let's not forget that Nigeria is having its fair share of, insurgents, Mali, Niger. I mean, it's an unending issue. And the question is, what is the way forward? How do we get ourselves out of this? Because, you know, we're also dealing with a pandemic that nobody knows how to, you know, cure. So the best that the world has come up with is a vaccination of sorts. And don't forget, Africa is somewhat ruled out of that plan for now, because there have been some whispers from, I think, AstraZeneca saying that they had no plans for Africa or rollout plan for Africa for now. So again, this is what we're facing, and we still have to deal with arms struggles. We still have to deal with ethnic and religious crisis. We still have to deal with internal crisis, you know, here and there. So they're just, I always say this, that if you were to drop a pen on the African map and just, you know, point it in any direction, there will be an issue one way or the other, a crisis, something. I mean, I was talking to somebody about Namibia, and Namibia is dealing with femicide. They might not be dealing with, you know, an armed conflict, but they are dealing with femicide. Women are being killed at will. So there are problems all across the continent. Unfortunately, the internet has not been friendly, and my guest is still struggling to get back in. Hopefully, if he does, we will just wrap up this conversation because we're almost out of time. Well, let me see if he can try again, and then we'll wrap this conversation. So once again, let me just play that video from the UNHCR, and then when we come back, we will be wrapping the conversation up. Don't forget, my guest is Imo Edet. He is a broadcast journalist with West African Democratic Radio in Dakar, Senegal, and he covers stories in the Sahel region. Most importantly, we'll take this video and be back with more conversations.
tum jiyo ya min jiyo ya ba biye min taman ne Allah bankan ya tun ko ba'al ma jiru wo de kar fiye kar ban tin ne ni tin ha ban tin mo ba kwa bi jiye bi to ala biya yar kaman ke ce
On ne parle plus de l'éducation, on ne parle plus des droits humanitaires, on ne parle que de la vie maintenant. On ne se soucie pas de l'alimentation ni d'autres choses. On se soucie de notre vie maintenant.
Well, we're still talking about what's happening in Burkina Faso, in case you're wondering. And if our forces are overstretched, then how do we deal with this? Do we need to call the international community to join us in this fight?
Well, just a few facts so you may know. On the 22nd of November 2020, we saw citizens of Burkina Faso going to the polls to vote in the presidential and legislative
if you can hear me.
I can hear you now. I can hear you now. Well, just for the record, so the conflict ravaged country was once peaceful, and IDPs soared well over 87,000 in January 2019 when this crisis started, to about 1.5, a little above 1 million as of November 2020. So we've also seen 3.2 million people face food crisis, with 1.8 million presumed to be in an emergency phase, just like Mary Ann did mention, and 300 of them are in catastrophe phases. That's according to the UN. So, so far, donors have provided well over 55% of funding needed to cover the basic humanitarian needs in Burkina Faso as of 2020. So now it's now left to President Christian Marc Kabore to revive whatever policy manifestos which he came up with during the electioneering campaign or electioneering period to implement these things. He needs to work closely with the opposition. He needs to work closely with people, religious leaders, especially in the northern part of the country, who can talk to, who can have a clear conversation with the insurgent or their leaders, especially those with, little faction groups here and there. So he needs to make that move. He needs to establish that conversation, a continuous conversation with these people. What are the problems? What can we do? What is it that you want? Otherwise, then we can say, let him launch a full attack and ensure that, those that have been displaced are returned back to their country. He needs to set up that motion immediately. I mean, there's really no point waiting. It's a new year. It is the fresh start of a second term for him. So he needs to do that to ensure that, the ones peaceful Burkina Faso, the ones peace that was being enjoyed by Burkinabe is returned to the country. Other than that, we should stop waiting for former colonial masters to come in to help. We can do it. ECOWAS can do it. MINUSMA is there. They can do it. Push these guys back and ensure that the region is secured, and the children and women, men that are displaced can, return back to their country. So that's what I think needs to be done. Negotiation, ongoing conversation with opposition, establish conversation with those, in the northern part of the country, and then we can get Burkina Faso back on track. Marianne.
Well, one of the comments made here, Jussie May says, a friend of mine is stuck in Burkina Faso. Thank you for this broadcast. And this is from a lady in the United States. Says that when you say stuck, meaning the person,
quite an unfortunate time for him to be stuck in Burkina Faso. I hope he's not, he or she is not from, is not stuck in the northern part of that country. Otherwise, he may just choose to stay in Ouagadougou, where it's relatively safe.
Well, almost all the time, the capital is always the safest place to stay. But I want to thank you so much, Imo, for speaking with us, even though the internet has not been very friendly to us today. But for those who are watching, Imo Edet is a broadcast journalist, and he works with West Africa Democratic Radio in Dakar, Senegal. I just put up a flyer from their radio station, so you can Google him, you can follow him on Twitter and on Instagram. You can find him on LinkedIn. He's an amazing broadcast journalist. He covers all the stories across the West African region. Thank you once again, Imo, for being part of this conversation. I really
thank you, Marianne, for having me. Apologies for the internet. It's been back and forth, and that's the problem with Africa. Until we can get it right, We will continue battling with little things like internet.
Yeah.
But I'm sure in the coming days, it will be better. Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
It will be better. Thank you so much, Imor, for joining us. And everybody who was part of the conversation, whether you watched us on Facebook, on Twitter, you watched us live as we streamed on YouTube. We appreciate you for being part of this conversation. We'll keep giving you up-to-date information as to what's happening across Africa, especially the underreported issues. Once again, I am Mary Ann Okon, and you can go on Twitter, on Facebook, or on YouTube, repost this video. Let somebody who's out there that does not know what's happening in Burkina Faso get an insight to what the people are experiencing. And of course, let conversations around how these issues can be handled continue. Have a lovely day. I'll see you soon when we'll talk about more stories coming from Africa. Have a good afternoon.